Crystal Story is redefining what it means to be a retro RPG, or at least that's what I'd like to say. I am admittedly feeling a little bit mixed about this title, but first, an explanation. That's originally how I started my review of Crystal Story Dawn of Dusk, when I first uploaded it to Medium on the 18th. Since then, there's been a few developments, developer reach out, and ultimately, positive changes that have left me feeling a lot better about this project. But before all that, we should probably answer the question, what is Crystal Story Dawn of Dusk? Released on January 12, 2024, Crystal Story is a short adventure game inspired by classic Zelda and Earthbound, with a little Final Fantasy thrown in for good measure. The story begins as many great RPGs do. Several millennia ago, in the world of Dawnside, knights and kings ruled the land. One day, it was discovered, a lone floating fortress amidst the sky. Upon the fortress was a mysterious crystal said to grant the wish of any who touch it. How a bunch of knights got up there in the first place? Unclear, but I'd like to think they just used a big ladder. Suffice to say, a discovery like this led to wars and countless died. Instead of a group of goddesses sealing it away as you might expect, the crystal eventually gave birth to an unstoppable monster. To stop further bloodshed, one of the remaining kings tasked their strongest knight with defeating the beast. Unable to kill it, the knight chose to use the crystal's power instead, sealing the monster away. The knight, in one final act, split the crystal into 4 pieces, secretly entrusting each piece to a guardian. Jumping forward in time, it's here we're introduced to Mina, a young girl with the metaphysical ability to control fire. It's been almost 4 years since Mina's brother went missing, and birthdays just aren't the same. In an effort to cheer her up, Mina's cousin Claude offers to take her on a trip up to the mountains. Things start to go bad when a colossal monster appears. With the help of her cousin, Mina defeats the behemoth, but not before it leaves behind a rift in reality. Before she has time to question it, Mina is pulled in. Inside the rift is where our story really begins, with Mina learning of the crystal and the ancient beast that came before. Overall, this is a great setup for a grand adventure. You can tell there's a lot of Zelda influence in it as well, just from how it's delivered. Of course, this won't be the last Zelda comparison. A lore dump later in the game, in particular, feels almost identical with that of the Great Deku Trees at the beginning of Ocarina of Time. And I don't mean to say that like it's a bad thing either. There's a lot of grandiosity associated with Zelda stories. And for the most part, I think Crystal Story pulls it off, at least from what's here. We'll get back to that later, but for now we can talk about the core gameplay. Being a Zelda-like, Mina controls as you would expect of Link, despite her model more closely resembling Ness. Puzzles, similarly, have a Zelda-like approach, which pays off for the most part. They focus more on learning the potential of your skills, rather than knowing where to use certain items. If you played something classic, like Link's Awakening recently, you'll know observation is typically the name of the game, and Crystal Story does a good job of following suit. There is a tendency to hold your hand in early game, a feature I'm not too fond of, but thankfully it's avoidable for the most part. Outside of exploration, encounters are originally what drew me to Crystal Story. On the surface, it looks like your run-of-the-mill Earthbound clone. It's only when the player acts that the encounters actually reveal their genius. You see, the only way to deal consistent damage in Crystal Story's encounters is to rely on Mina's pyromantic abilities, which the game calls arts. Performing arts requires AP. AP is gained through charge sequences. As it turns out, these sequences take the form of a mini dungeon puzzle. This, for me, is huge. Not only are old mechanics being made relevant again, but they're being thrown at the player quickly. These sequences are timed, so if you didn't master a mechanic before, you better now. And just so you know, you don't get any AP without a solve, so it's back to dodging boss attacks. That's the other thing. Boss attacks place Mina into a similar setup, only instead of solving puzzles, your goal is primarily to dodge oncoming attacks. It's this sort of dynamic that makes Crystal Story's boss encounters so engaging. A player who struggles with the mechanics may have a more difficult time with the fights, while other players, who take time to master the mechanics, can potentially perfect a boss. Ultimately, it's not something too dissimilar to Undertale. It's that sort of same brand of hectic and engaging. For me, solving puzzles is something I'd much prefer, and that's why the mechanics really speak to me. This brings us back to my original statement I made on the 18th, and why I'm feeling so mixed about Crystal Story. The current runtime of Crystal Story Dawn of Dusk is 3 hours. This, on its own, isn't an issue for me. Neither is the price, which at full is $19.49 Canadian, Some of my favorite games are similarly short adventures that demand the same price, If Found being a primary example. Rather, my issue as it stands comes from a place of advertising. You see, when Crystal Story first released, the language used to describe the game was much different than what it is now. Using the Wayback Machine, we can see it was originally described as the first in the Crystal Story epic. To me and many others, this suggests a much longer, more complete experience, and that's simply not the case. If you were to compare what's available in the current build, and reaching back to my previous example, Crystal Story has basically the length of Kokiri Forest and the Great Deku Tree. While it's a good starting point, it does give a sense that you've never really left the tutorial. And more importantly, it begs the question, why was it released like this? Well, if you were to scroll all the way down to the original store page, you'll eventually reach a section regarding dynamic updates. On the surface, it's a nice promise. You buy the game, and we'll continually update it with new stuff to do. Sounds like a solid strategy, and it's worked for a number of different titles before. However, when you consider where the game is now, it does start to look a bit bad. Some of these reviews aren't exactly helping either, and it's not like gamers have had the best of luck in recent years. Obviously, this was a cause for concern for me when I first wrote my original article, although not for the reason you might think. You see, if you were to actually play the game and finish it, the answer to the question I posed becomes pretty clear. Why release it like this? Well, simply because it's done. I mean, not actually, there's definitely a lot more to come, but the story so far actually wraps up really nicely. If it helps, you can think of Crystal Story Dawn of Dusk as episode 1 of a much larger story. And if you've read my article, you'll know that's more or less the take I arrived on. One brief interaction with the developer Fred Brown later, and I have to wonder if he took what I said to heart. If you were to look at the store page today, the language has been updated to better describe what Crystal Story is, and it seems the game is being better received because of it. Well, that and Fred's commitment to providing updates and fixes. Speaking of which, the first official newsletter came out the other day. There's not much in the form of concrete additions, but there's a great amount of transparency. If Fred can achieve that, then I don't see much trouble in waiting. That being said, if you were to ask me if I'd recommend buying Crystal Story currently, I'd say do what's best for you. What's here is good, it's just not done. As always, there'll be a link to my original article in the description. You can always follow me on Twitter or X for updates. I'm trying to make more stuff again, and there shouldn't be as much of a wait between videos. Either way, I'll see you then.